Thanks, Laura. That's wonderful. It's good to see everybody here. My name is Christine. My pronoun are she, her, hers, and I am your sexuality educator this evening. I work for Alberta Health Services. That's the government department that runs healthcare in the province of Alberta. You've probably heard a lot about us in the last little while. The department I work for, like Laura said, is Sexual and Reproductive Health in Calgary Zone. Our job is to support anybody in the community learn about healthy sexuality whenever they ask, and that's kind of what I'm doing here with you today. Like many of you, I am not only a professional, I am also a parent and a community member, a family member. I happened to also be licensed as a child development supervisor in Alberta, and I have a career that spans things like working as an early learning and childcare support person, running an after-school care program, being a nanny. I taught in Calgary schools for about 7 or 8 years, and now I'm here in this role as education coordinator. Even though I'm wearing many hats, though, I am here today as your sexuality educator. But if I'm going back and forth between giving some examples from when I was working in early learning and childcare or with my own family, I'll let you know when I'm kind of switching my hat back and forth. I'm probably not quite as tech savvy as some of the folks that you may have seen presentations for, but I'm going to be doing my best. And I would like to start by just acknowledging that Community Education Services acknowledge that the land on which we virtually gathered today is the traditional territories of the people of Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. And it is in the spirit of respect, reciprocity, and reconciliation that I also acknowledge that even though I'm coming to you today from the comfort of my own basement, which is on Treaty 7 territory, I know many of us here are coming from all sorts of areas that are the traditional lands of many different First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. I also want to take a moment just to thank you. I know that we all have competing priorities right now. We have many things to do, many demands on our time and on our attention. And you've made the choice to spend some time here with the rest of us this evening. The choice to learn about supporting healthy baby and child sexual development, and the choice to learn more about how, when, and why to talk to children about bodies, relationships, and sexuality. Making that choice today is going to equip you to help build the health of the young children and families in your life. And it's also going to help build the health of all of our communities. So again, I want to take a moment to thank you for that. So I guess we'll just get started. The first thing we always do in our education programs at Alberta Health Services Sexual and Reproductive Health is we start with some group agreements. And our group agreements always start by letting you know that you're welcome here and you belong here. We have group agreements with every session, even the sessions where we don't have the time to go back and forth and do a lot of interaction. And this is because it kind of sets the framework to let you know the philosophies that I'm teaching from. I also know that we're all coming into this session today coming from different places. We have some of the participants who already feel comfortable and confident talking and learning about sexuality and talking and learning about sexuality, bodies, and relationships in the context of young children. If that's you, I hope you're getting some new tips and tricks and things to try. Feel free to be commenting and ask questions in the chat box. We'll leave some time at the end for you to do that. And we're also going to try a few different places to be interactive in here. So if you're able, take that leadership role and be participatory. There's going to be folks in here who feel a little bit awkward or unsure or embarrassed talking and learning about sexuality with young children. If that's you, I'm really hoping that today we're going to be able to build your comfort and confidence. But I'm also very well aware that there's some folks in here who don't feel comfortable and don't even feel uncomfortable, but we might find sessions like that a little bit triggering or might make us feel unsafe. That's one of the reasons we have these group agreements, is to let you know that we're making great efforts to try and create the safest space we can for you to learn. This might be true for you if you come from a history of violence, sexual abuse, sexual trauma. If you've ever been harmed or fear being harmed because of your personal sexuality, or even if you come from a family or a community where talking about sexuality was taboo. I can say with confidence that learning about sex and sexuality on your terms and how it relates to the young children in your life helps bring power back where it belongs, which is with you. We all deserve to feel comfortable and confident in our bodies and in our relationships and in our sexuality, whatever that means to us. And that's true for you today as a participant, and it's true for any babies and young children you might have in your life. So to that end, in creating these safer spaces, we do have these group agreements. I'm hoping that we can agree to respect all the ways that we're different. What that means is you belong here. We have diversity. We're all different in our beliefs and values, our race, culture, religion, sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, age, our roles, how we feel, what we do during the day. We will respect all the ways you're different. We're also having different beliefs and values. My job here today isn't to tell you what to believe. It's not to tell you what to value. It's not even to tell you what you should or shouldn't be doing. My job, I'm going to give you some good information. It's going to be up to date. It is going to be accurate, and it's going to be as objective as I can make it, one human being to another. Your job is to really think about your beliefs and values, and we'll take some time to do that this evening and put those together with some of the information you're getting today. When those get put together, you roll out with choices that are great for you, whether you're here as a parent or another family member or support person, as a professional working with young children, or even as a community member who's just here to up your knowledge so that you can take action in your communities to make them as healthy as possible. We have the right to join in our pass. So when we have the opportunity to participate, of course you can or cannot. It's up to you how interactive you make this course. We know that learning often happens best when you're interacting with the material a little bit, but I also know you have other things going on for you while you're attending this workshop tonight. We'll respect each other by listening. That's not really an issue in this one because I suspect everybody's on mute and I'm the only one who's talking. Well, if you're at home and there are other things that are demanding your time and need your attention, please give those things your attention. If you're feeling distracted by things that don't really need your attention, if you're able, try and focus as much as you can today on what's going on. We will respect the right to privacy, so anything that's happening in the chat or in the interactions is private and it stays here. If there is a recording of this session, all of the private information will be, I will make sure that it's not available for anyone to see. If I've said it though, it's not private. Please share this information with anybody that you can. We want to make sure that people have access to the information, including people who weren't able to be here today. And I also want to open up that any question is okay. You have a sexpert here with you for the next hour and 20 minutes or so. Take advantage of my knowledge while I'm here. I'm here for you, not the other way around. Now, another reason that we put these group agreements on a slide, even when we're not having the chance to have a lot of interaction, is because it models the philosophy that I'm teaching from. So you can count on me today to be following these group agreements. But the other reason I'm putting it in here is as the children in your life start to get older and move through different developmental stages, this actually offers a framework to kind of carry out all those conversations you might have with your children. Imagine how positive and affirming the conversations with our children could be, even if they're about tough topics, if we've agreed to respect that our children might be different from us. We respect that we have different beliefs and values from different people, including the people who are closest to us sometimes. We give each other the chance to join in or pass. Sometimes we demand answers, and sometimes the children in our life might need a few moments to kind of regroup and reset themselves. We'll respect each other by listening, privacy, and any question is okay. All of those can be the foundation of healthy conversations about sexuality as the children and families in your life continue to get older. This also can be a great foundation for some of the other conversations that we have with other people in our lives, whether they're friends, partners, healthcare providers, colleagues. So this is the reason that I'm putting this in here. And so that's one of the reasons we'll send you this handout later on, so you can turn back and look at these group agreements. So here's my goal here today. I'm hoping that we're going to learn and become more comfortable talking with young children, including babies, about sexuality, bodies, and relationships. We're going to do that. We're going to identify some of the reasons to start talking about sexuality, bodies, and relationships with people as early as infants. We're going to think about the impact of our personal values on how we're interacting with the youth in our, or the children and babies in our life. We're going to work on gaining an understanding of age-appropriate sexual behavior and sexual development. And we're going to talk a bit about what you can do to create healthy environments for the children in your life's learning at home, at preschool, and other places that you might be interacting with these young kids. I think I'd like to take a moment to learn a little bit about who is in here. So here's your first chance to use the chat feature that Laura was talking about. Somewhere on your screen, you likely have a little speech bubble looking thing, or it might say the word chat. In that chat box, can you enter to everyone who you are in relation to babies and young people? Are you a parent, guardian, foster parent? Are you a kinship caregiver? Are you a grandparent, auntie, uncle who's supporting someone with babies and young children? Are you a professional? Maybe you work in childcare or run a day home. Maybe you're a social worker, family support worker. Are you a combination of all of the above? Or are you a community member who's here today to learn more about this topic, so that when you're moving through the world as a community member, you've got this piece of information to support your friends, families, neighbors, and colleagues? So let's see who we have. We've got some folks here who are identifying as a dad, first-time moms, parents, lots of parents, some that are parents and professionals. Some are working in various professions, including Indigenous-led youth anti-trafficking projects, child development specialists, ed assistants. Oh, we have a wide range of folks in here for us today. So I'm going to let you have just a minute more in case you're figuring out the chat and want to enter who you are in relation to babies and young children in your life. And I do want to thank you all for being here. When we have this much diversity in a session like this, it means we're able to approach the topic of teaching young children and babies about bodies, relationships, and sexuality from all different angles. And that's how we build the strongest families and communities. So thanks everybody for taking that moment to let us know who's in here, who's who in the zoo. The next thing I'd like you to do, this is private. This isn't something that, thank you for everyone for putting those in. This one is private. This is for you to kind of think about on your own. I'm going to ask a question, and I'm going to ask you to not share this in the chat, because we all have different histories. We all have different experiences, beliefs, values, and there are different things that brought us all in here today. And as you go through this session, and as we're doing different topics and different activities, I want you to kind of sit back and think about where you are emotionally and feeling. For some folks, this might be, taking this course might be a risk for you. So here are the questions I would like you to think about. What do you feel when you think about talking to children in general? And again, this is private for you. So what do you feel when you think about talking with children, talking with babies, talking with your own children for those of you who are parents, or the children that you work with for those of you working in community? I then want you to think about, what do you feel when you think about talking to children about bodies, relationships, and sexuality? Do you feel knowledgeable, comfortable, confident? Do you feel a bit unsure or awkward? Do you feel terrified or unwilling, unable to have that conversation? Or do you really not know how you feel about that yet because you haven't had the chance to give it very much thought? And the last thing I'd like you to reflect on before we get into the bread and butter of today's topic is I want you to think about, what did the adults in your life seem to feel about talking with you about bodies, relationships, and sexuality? When you were a young child, did you get the feeling that the adults in your life were knowledgeable, comfortable, and confident talking to you about bodies, relationships, and sexuality? Or did you get the feeling that they were a bit unsure, awkward, terrified, or unwilling, unable? Or do you not remember that part of your life, like is true for many of us? Now that we've had that chance to do a bit of personal reflection, I do want to take a moment to just say that this session is about building your comfort and confidence. I want to make sure that the next time somebody asks you to reflect on how do you feel about talking to your children or the children in your life about bodies, relationships, and sexuality, I would love for you to be able to feel a little bit more comfortable, a little bit more confident, and a little bit more willing and ready to give it a go. To do that, we really need to do terms of reference. We often talk about sex and sexuality interchangeably, but it's really important that we understand they are different topics. When we think about what is sex, we're often thinking about one of two things. We're either thinking about a label that's assigned at birth to babies by a healthcare provider based on their reproductive anatomy. We also sometimes think about the act of sex. Now, I'm not going to make anybody give an example of how they would define sex. I'm going to actually say to you how I might define sex if I was talking with young children. But in general, when we're thinking about supporting healthy sexual development in young children, or talking to children about bodies, relationships, and sexuality, we're not really focusing on talking to them about sex itself or the sex act. However, once in a while, especially as children start to move into preschool, into those 3 to 5 year age range, kids will often have questions. Sometimes they're questions about, where do babies come from? Or if they see somebody who's pregnant or you happen to be pregnant, they might want to know how the baby's there, or got there. Or if they've heard the word sex somewhere at preschool or at a day home or on TV or wherever they might have heard it, they might come to you and ask. This is your chance to give them an answer in a way that's clear, accurate, simple, age appropriate, and here's the best part for those of you who are parents or primary caregivers, within your personal family values. So, I wish I could say I was a fantastic parent to all 3 of my kids. In some ways I was adequate, some ways better, some ways worse. But when it came to my 3rd child, who came home from daycare one day and asked me straight out, "Mommy, what is sex?" Some child had used that. I was ready this time. And the definition I gave, and this doesn't have to be your definition, but the definition I gave was, sex is when one person's body touches another person's genitals or private parts, and we'd already talked as a family what that meant. And it's not for cleaning them, and it's not for going to the doctor. And some types of sex where a penis touches a vagina can be how babies get made. But then here's the part that really works for those of us who are parents or primary caregivers. In our family, what I then shared was our family values, which are, it's something that adults do when they care about each other very much. So when a child comes to you and you're in the parenting role, you get the opportunity to do that. For those of you who are in a support role where you're supporting parents and families, maybe as a child support specialist or a day home provider, a daycare worker, and in another capacity, you can support parents to build that comfort and confidence. Now, this doesn't come easy for folks. And that's one of the reasons that lots of people kind of hold off on saying what it is, especially with young children. They're often worried, well, what happens? Am I teaching them too much? Is it too early? Are they too young? And we go back to in public health, which is what sexual and reproductive health is part of. We go back to, what body science do children need to know to continue healthy development? And we know that the process of reproduction is body science. Now, sometimes you're not ready to give the answer yet. There's resources available at the Calgary Public Library. They actually have book lists that show books for parents of children and professionals who are working with children of every age level, 0 to 6, 6 to 12, and then teens, that actually give you resources that you can read with your child or read for yourself to help give you some of the language that might be a good fit for your family. But this session is about teaching your child about sexuality, bodies, and relationships. And that's where we look at the word sexuality and we think of it as kind of a bigger idea. Sexuality is all sorts of things. We're all sexual beings from birth through death. It includes our reproductive system, our emotions, our need for relationships. It's a core part of being human. We sometimes talk about sexuality in terms of a sexuality wheel. And we think of it as sexuality is one of those wheels that helps us keep rolling as a human being. I'm going to pull it up for you right now to let us all look at this sexuality wheel. It's the concept that if sexuality is one of the wheels that keeps us rolling as a human being, every wheel is made up of different spokes. So when we think about what is sexuality, so what are we actually talking about and teaching with our young children? There are things like values, the sets of ideas that we see as most important, or assumptions about how things are, relationships, communication, how we're socializing each other, what are the norms and behaviors that are acceptable in our family and in our communities and culture. Things like body image, self-image, the experiences we have, our sex assigned at birth, orientation, gender expression, gender identity, and our personality. All of these things, just going to stop sharing, all of these things are part of our sexuality. And that's really what we're talking about today. All right, I'm just going to share again. Sorry about this, a little bit clunky. I'm going to get so cool and smooth at this someday. But for today, we're going to be a little bit clunky. There we go. All right. So before we start talking about how and when and why to talk to young children and babies about sex and sexuality, I want to take a moment and think back. In the chat, if you're willing and able, I'd like you to think back of where did you learn about sex and sexuality? So if you could bring that up in the chat. So where did you learn about sex and sexuality? All right, so we're getting some pretty interesting answers in here. I was handed a book, asked if I had any questions. That was my personal experience as well. A mixture of home, school, friends, family, peers media school, friends and older siblings. Somebody's identified a rogue, forward-looking teacher. Lots of folks are saying from my family, and a few folks are saying not from my family. So we're getting quite a range of where people have learned about sex and sexuality. I'd like to take a moment and just address all of the folks who said or might say, I didn't learn about this from my family. And I'm going to kind of throw out a challenging idea that sometimes if we come from families where parents, caregivers don't talk about this, it actually does teach us something. Oh, somebody's watched that video, where do babies come from? I use that with my older children. When we think about families where the parents don't talk about this at all, they're actually teaching their children quite a bit about sexuality. Sometimes they're teaching that it's taboo, or that in that family, we don't talk about this. Sometimes it teaches children, even youngest children, that their bodies or their questions or their curiosity is not okay. So thinking about all of those ways you learned, peers, media school, friends, some people learned from a faith-based organization. I want you to ask yourself this. Please don't put this one in the chat. I want you to think for yourself, how did that work for you? When you think about how you learned about sex and sexuality as a child and a youth, all those ways that you're thinking of, how did that work for you? Did it mean that you were able to enter adulthood confident and comfortable in your body, in your relationships and ability to form them, in your sexuality, whatever that means for you? Were you comfortable and confident in the idea of maybe considering having a sexual relationship, how to negotiate that relationship, consent, set boundaries, respect boundaries, communicate needs, wants, goals? Now, often if I'm in a group where we're all together in a room, and maybe someday that will happen again, sometimes when I say, where did you learn and how did that work for you? But don't tell me how it worked for you. I can see from facial expressions that for lots of folks, it didn't work great. For some folks, they entered adulthood not quite having what they needed, and they've spent some of their adulthood kind of filling in those gaps. Hopefully, in your role, whether it's as a parent, professional, or community member, you can start to help children fill in those gaps so that they have it better than we might have. Now, here's your last question. And again, you don't have to put this in the chat. Just think to yourself, how do kids today learn? Now, I think about all of the parent sessions I've done, and almost what happens inevitably is I'll put up a chart. How did you learn? And we write the same things that you've written down in here in the chat today. They say, well, where do the kids today learn? And guess what happens? We figure out the kids are learning the same way. They're learning from peers and media, TV, music, songs, school, movies, teachers, faith. More or less, they're learning from the same places. But parents and professionals are now also identifying a couple of differences. And they will often identify things like social media or more sexualized media, which can be true. I know that I often look at today's media and think it's much more sexual than when I was growing up. But I also know that my dad looked at the media I consumed as a child and teen and thought it was much more sexual than he had growing up. And I know his dad felt the same way because they stopped their subscription of the Sears robot calendar back in the 1930s because it was showing too graphic images of corsets and brassieres. So I know that every generation kind of thinks that the new media is much more sexualized than the old media. There's arguments both ways for that. But the changes that we do know that young children and as they get older are likely to be experiencing are the advent of social media. That's a bit of a different beast than many of us had growing up, depending on the ages of us in here. And the access to internet sexually explicit images and media. Now, neither of those are necessarily things that the babies and young children are going to be exposed to. But the work we do today in building our comfort and confidence to talk to babies and young children about bodies, relationships, and sexuality means that as the kids we work with and our own children start to get a little bit older, we have the comfort and confidence to start talking to them about these other things related to sexuality. So as our kids start accessing the internet, hopefully at first with us and our support, but as they get older on their own, helping teach them the skills to critically interpret different types of media, how to set boundaries for themselves and for others, and how to stay safe. That's what this class is about. Here's another question for you, and you can post these answers in the chat if you're willing. I'd love to see what you think. As a parent or caregiver, oh, we've already done this one. Oh, actually, you know what? Let's do a poll. I'd actually like to know what exactly you learned from your parents or caregivers. Let's keep looking back in time a little bit. So here's a poll. On your screen, a poll question should have popped up. And it says, what did your parents and primary caregivers teach you about sexuality? Was it not a thing? A bit, but it might have done more harm than good. A bit, and it was okay, and quite a lot. We're going to give you about a minute to answer this question. So take a check off where you are, click submit, and in, oh, I don't know, it looks like about 30 seconds or so, we're going to kind of see where we're at. Now, as we're filling out this poll, I'm just going to remind us, for those of us that are clicking off not a thing, I want you to think for a moment, what did that teach you about it? And did that influence how you were feeling when you started this workshop today? For those of you who did click, I've learned quite a lot. How did that influence where you're at today? And some of those other answers, how did that work for you? All right, so we have, it looks like 13 of about 47 of us, not a thing. We didn't learn anything from our parents or primary caregivers. A small handful of us, about 6, learned a bit, but worried it might have done a bit more harm than good. And for those of us where that's our answer, that means that we've put in quite a lot of effort as adults to make sure that we're able to do better for our own children and the babies and children in our life. A bit, and it was okay. And then we had about 3 of 47 learned quite a lot. So that's a fairly small group. And I'm hoping that when I do this session again in 5 years from now, 10 years from now, and if I'm still working 20 years from now, that we will see that poll change a little bit. And we have a handful of folks who are unwilling or unable to participate in that. Now I want you to think a little bit further back, because often when I ask, where did you learn about sex and sexuality? We go all the way back and think about, well, when I was old enough for them to talk to me about puberty or sex or reproduction. But I want you to think further back, because we know from research and practice that from birth, children are learning about sexuality. They're learning about self-image and communication and relationships, what to expect from the people who they love and count on. They learn about this from the way their bodies are touched, from how their bodies feel. They learn about sex and sexuality from the words that family members and caregivers use and don't use for body parts, and watching the roles and relationships around them. This means that whether or not we want to, if we are in the life of a baby or a young child, we are teaching them in every interaction, including teaching them about sex and sexuality. And here are a few ways that we sometimes think or sometimes are teaching in ways we don't recognize. So again, do not answer this on your chat. I'm going to throw out a question for you to think about in your head. But I'm going to give several behaviors that parents or child caregivers, babysitters, friends and family members might do that could be teaching children something about sexuality without recognizing that they're teaching something. So what are we teaching when we say that some clothes or toys are only for boys or girls? Now, in some families, this is teaching important family gender roles that aligns with the family's culture, the family's expectations. But what happens when children go to school and are pressuring others to fit within those specific stereotypical roles? Or if a child doesn't fit comfortably in those roles, it can teach them that there's something wrong or bad with them. It can also, and this is especially true for preschoolers, is when we are teaching a lot about gender roles that are related to stereotypes, sometimes those 3 to 5-year-olds become gender warriors, and they demand others fit their idea of the roles and expectations that they think should fit with a particular sex or gender. What about this one? What are we teaching when we act shocked or disappointed about body curiosity? So an example of this would be if you're sitting with a young preschooler or a toddler and you're having snack and they reach over and they maybe touch a body part that is private on you. So a breast or a genital area through your clothes. Now, there's nothing wrong with setting boundaries about what's private and what's public and what parts we can and can't touch. But what this question is what if you act shocked or surprised or disappointed, like, oh, get off of me, and then be very angry? What could that teach? And that can teach children that they need to be embarrassed about their curiosity. There's something wrong with those body parts. And it can kind of shut that down and create feelings of shame. Now, if a baby, toddler, or preschooler does violate a boundary that way, something you can say is, oh, you've just touched my, and then whatever body part it was they touched, breast, genitals, whatever it is. Oh, you've just touched my bum. Bums are private. We don't touch each other's bums. right? And so then you can make it kind of calm, respond in a respectful way, and set a boundary all at the same time while avoiding shaming a child for a typical type of curiosity. What if we don't use accurate terms for body parts? Now, when we talk about accurate terms, we're talking about body science terms. If English is a language that you speak as a first language at home, when we're talking about body parts, we might talk about breasts, bum, a vagina and a vulva, which is the area around the vagina, penis, testicles. Those might be the words we would use as accurate body science terms. If you speak a language other than English at home, you can also use those accurate body science terms when you're talking about those body parts. If we don't use accurate terms or body science terms for body parts, we actually create a cycle of people not having the knowledge they need to protect, take care of, and respect their body. It also teaches children, especially babies and young children, that we don't talk about this here. And when it comes to sexuality, we want to create environments where the young children in our lives feel safe to talk to us about it. So when we're using fake words or made up words or silly slang words, it can be demeaning to those body parts, but it can also create confusion about what's wrong with those body parts. I can go to the dentist. If I have a sore tooth, I can go to a dentist, make a phone call and say, hey, I need to come see the dentist. I actually have some pain in my lower right molar, and they can call me in and we can talk right through it. So there's no confusion, no ambiguity. We all know what we're talking about. When we give children access to the accurate body science terms, we give them access to be able to talk about this with other people. We also know it is a protective factor when it comes to sexual abuse of children. Children who have come from families where they do have and use accurate terms for body science, for body parts, we know that they're less likely to be victimized. And that's in part because people recognize that this child can and will talk about this, and they come from environments where talking about this is safe. How about this one? What do we teach when we show disappointment when a child resists a hug? Now here's an example. Let's imagine that you have a family member over and they go to hug your young child and they don't want to hug that family member. And that family member is very disappointed. And sometimes the primary caregiver parent might even kind of pressure a child to hug that person against what they want to do. Or I know for me, with one of my children, she would fall and scratch herself up. She was a very active child. And when I would often sweep in to give her a hug without asking permission first, she would often push me away. Now, as a parent, my feelings were actually hurt a little bit by that. But our babies and young children's bodies aren't for keeping the adults feeling safe, right? So if we show disappointment when our children resist a hug, we're actually teaching them that their bodies are for our emotional well-being. Instead, what we can now do, if we want a hug from our child or we want to offer our child a hug, let's imagine my child falls, she scrapes up her knee again, and I go in and I say, you know what, you fell. Sometimes when you fall and it hurts, you want a hug. Do you want to hug mom right now? And the answer can be yes, and the answer can be no. Now, in the case of this particular child, the answer was more likely than not to have been no. And then I could say, okay, well, you let me know if you change your mind. I'm here and available for a hug. And in the case of a family member leaving and wanting a hug, and the child resists, you can say, oh, it looks like you don't want to hug this family member right now. That's okay. You can wave goodbye or say goodbye, or maybe you can hug her another time. Now, here's the last one I want to think about. And this one is, what are we teaching when we play the tickle game? And that means we're tickling a child and they say stop. Now, when we play that tickle game with children, we often do it because it's fun, and everyone involved often has fun. But almost inevitably, we reach a point where we're tickling and the child's running around, no, no, and we tickle some more and the child runs around, no, no. And then there's a point in the conversation, and sometimes the adults will miss it, where the child's no actually suddenly means a no. They're done the tickle game. But if we keep tickling them, we might have taught them that when they say stop, we'll keep going. And if saying stop is part of the tickle game and they're saying stop, but they really mean let's going, That's one way to, if we keep going and they're saying stop, but they mean keep going, that creates really confusing communication. And so absolutely, we can say, when they say stop, we can stop. And that's going to teach them that when they say stop and no, they can expect people to stop whatever it is they're doing, stop the touch. That's a great way to start that consent conversation. Now, I know people do that tickling game because it is great fun. And with my oldest two children, absolutely, I would tickle them, and they would laugh and say stop, and we'd run around and tickle them again. And we had a great old time. But I could still have that same great time with my youngest when I'd learned some of these tools and tips and information. So I would tickle that child. And it's like, do you want to tickle? Yeah, and we'd tickle. And then we'd run around. Do you want another tickle? Yeah, and run around. And so I'm asking permission and getting a yes. So that's giving consent and asking for consent. And we would get to the place, do you want to tickle? And it would be, no. It's like, and I would jump off, hands back. It's like, okay. And then I kind of look to gauge if we're still playing a game or not. And when it looked like we're still playing a game, it's like, do you want to tickle now? No. Do you want to tickle now? No. Do you want to tickle now? Yes. And then absolutely we could play tickle again. And during that process, we're actually teaching about consent, that they can count on people to respect their boundaries, especially the adults that they know and trust. Another question, and we can put this one in the chat, I think. What do you want for your children's sexuality or the children in your life sexuality? When you think about the babies and young children in your life, or the babies and young children you may have in your life someday, or the babies and young children in the families that you work with, what do you want for their sexuality? Now, remember, we're not just talking about sex. We are talking about relationships, communication, self and body esteem, comfort and confidence with themselves. What do you want for your child's sexuality? So we're starting to see some answers coming in to feel confident, freedom, comfort, respect, safety, knowledgeable, happy, healthy, lots of confident, respected. And some folks are saying, you know, I'm not sure, but I want to give them information. I don't want to give them too much at the wrong times. And we're going to cover that in a few moments for those of you who are thinking, well, I want to do something, but I'm still not sure where and when. Often that's what we hear. So we hear parents and family members. We also hear professionals say that they want kids to be healthy, happy, have great relationships, safe, comfort, consensual, confidence, respect, knowledgeable. Some folks are even able to say, well, when they get older, to make healthy sexual decisions. And through a conversation, when we're having more back and forth, probably the most common answer I get in parent sessions is, and in professional sessions, is that they want the children in their life to be able to form strong, healthy values and make their sexual choices based on those strong, healthy values. And that means we need to take a moment to think about where children learn their values from. So we know children learn their values. So first of all, values are kind of what's right and wrong for us. You might have already been talking about, oh, thank you for continuing to add to the chat. It's wonderful for me to know all of the things you're hoping for the children in your life, the children you work with, the children you might have someday. So values are what's right or wrong for us. You might have been thinking about other ways you're teaching children in your life values, like we don't bite the dog, we don't throw our food at our sister. We have all sorts of these little values, things that are right in our family, in our communities, and in our cultures. Often it has to do with respect for self, respect for others, respect for the environment and the community. And these personal, family, and cultural values are a really important part of everyone's identity and everyone's sexuality. And we learn values a little bit about what people tell us right or wrong. So we can directly teach children about right or wrong. Well, in our family, that's not okay. In our family, we believe this. We then learn a lot of our values by observing the people we care about. So if we say one thing, especially to our young children, preschoolers, and then we do another thing that is the opposite of that, the children and young people in our lives are going to learn more by watching what we do instead of listening to what we say. That's why it's really important to model the values and the behaviors we're hoping to see in our babies' children and as they grow up into older children and adolescents. But to be honest, we mostly learn our values from our feelings and experiences. We combine what we were taught with what we've seen, and then as we move through life, what we feel and what we experience, that's where we build most of our values. Now, talking to our children about sexuality teaches them that we as the adults in their life value their bodies, their relationships, their sexuality, and their safety. So just by starting these conversations with babies, toddlers, and preschoolers, we're teaching them about this value we have and that we value who they are. Now, some parents hope that by not talking about sexuality, they're going to protect their child's innocence, that they're going to keep their child from being exposed to this and somehow it will be protective. But I can tell you right now that the research on this topic is clear. If we don't talk about this with babies and young children, and then as they move older into the later childhood years, we know that those kids are more likely to have sex earlier and are less safe when they have sex or do higher risk sexual behaviors. And then as they get older, they would also have higher rates of STI pregnancy and violent dating relationships. Now, we know when we're talking about children aged 0 to 6, those topics seem really far off. But this is the foundation we can make now to increase positive health outcomes later. Because when teens come from families where we've talked about this, and from day homes where the providers have supported families to learn about talking about this, and have communities where we're able to talk about this, they have sex later. They're safer when they do have sex, and they're less likely to be involved in intimate partner violence, and they're more likely to tell people if they've ever been harmed or abused. So, I think we're going to take some time to do a few more polls. For us to be able to be teaching to our children and the children in our lives about sex and sexuality, we're sometimes teaching specifically about our personal or our family values. And here are three topics that different families and different individuals have different values about. There isn't one right or wrong value in these in general, or even one right or wrong thing in terms of medical science. But in your family and in your personal life, you likely do have what you think is right or wrong in these situations. So do we have a poll we can pull up, Laura, about
yes.
values about? So your first poll is going to be, what are your values about bathing or showering with your young child? And if you don't have a baby or a young child in your life, think about it in general. What do you think is right or wrong when it comes to what do you think about parents who do bathe or shower with their babies and young child? Do you think it's good and healthy? Do you think it might be okay, but you personally aren't comfortable with it? Do you think it's bad or wrong or unhealthy? Or you don't know because you hadn't given that much thought before. So we're going to give about a minute for you to answer this poll with those 4 options. Good, healthy, might be okay, not comfortable, bad, unhealthy, or you just don't know. Now this is one, just so you know, from a health or a science perspective, there's not one right or wrong answer to this. This is kind of how values work. It's not something somebody else can tell you this is right or this is wrong. All right, let's see what the results for that one were. What did you think? We've got a few people saying the majority of people didn't respond to this one, but the next majority thinks it's good or healthy. And quite a few thought it might be okay, but I'm not comfortable with it. Some folks are saying, well, it's bad, or, oh, nobody has said it's bad or unhealthy. And some folks like, I don't know about that. Now let's imagine that you have a personal value where you're saying it's good and healthy. Here's where you can actually step in and teach a value. So if you're in a family where parents and young children might bathe together, you can teach them things like, in our family, we bathe together. It saves water, if that's the reason. Or we celebrate our different bodies, if that's the reason. Or it's easier and we may as well spend this extra time together. So whatever the reason is where you think it's good or healthy to do it, you can teach them that And then you can say this, when you get older, we might choose to bathe separately to respect each other's privacy. Because for most families that do bathe together, there becomes a point in their child's development where bathing together stops. And then whoever it makes uncomfortable first, that's when it would stop. So let's imagine you have a child who's moving up and starting puberty and suddenly wants private time for their bath time. That's when those family baths would stop. Or as the child's growing up, if one of the parents is now thinking, my kid's getting a little bit older, this feels kind of weird or bad for me, that's where you can say, you know what, now that you're older, we're going to respect each other's privacy for bath time. But if let's imagine you were from a family or personal beliefs that says, we don't bathe together with young children, that's where you get a chance to say things like, bathing is private. When you're very young, I can help you learn how to clean yourself, or I can even clean you right now when you're very young. But when people are old enough in our family to bathe themselves, they do it in private. Now let's see another, let's explore these values a little bit more. Let's pull up that next poll, Laura. What are your values about family nudity? So this is where family members would walk around the house naked. Some families who are involved in family nudity may do it at different public nude or naturalist places, but even in the house where parents and children might walk around the house naked. Do you think family nudity is good or healthy? It might be okay, but I'm not comfortable with it. It's bad or unhealthy, or I don't know. Now, again, we're going to give this one a minute so you have some time to respond. And as you can probably guess, anytime we're talking about values, there's not going to be immutably right or wrong answer. It's going to be depending on you, your family values, your faith values, your cultural values, your personal values, your history, your experience, what feels right or wrong for you. All right, let's see what the results are for this one. Oh, it's like waiting for an exciting present. All right, so we had only a few people not answer this one. So a handful said it's good or healthy. The majority said, well, it might be good, but I'm not personally comfortable with it. Some said it's bad or unhealthy, so it goes against their values. And a few said that they don't know. Now, once again, here's the opportunity to teach your values. So let's imagine you come from, we used to call them naked families at the daycare that I worked for, where the families are naked in the house. If that happens to be you, you can say, in our family, we spend time together naked. We do it because we want to feel comfortable in our bodies. It feels easier, and we want to celebrate each other's body forms. And then you can teach them, but lots of other families aren't naked families. So when we go to other people's houses, we would respect the privacy and stay clothed in those places. If you come from a family that doesn't have family nudity, you can just, if people are running around your house naked, as some preschoolers and are known to do, strip off and run around the house, you think, oh, I see you're naked. In our family, naked bodies are private. And so we would put on clothes when we're around other family members. So you get to teach the family value, say what the behavior you're looking for is. Now, I think we have one more that we're going, actually, you know what? I don't think we're going to do this last poll. Instead, I would like you to just think for yourself, what are your personal and family values about kissing and showing affection for your partner around your children? Like with the other ones, there's not a right or wrong one, but once you know what your values are, then you can start sharing those with the children in your life. If you're one of the folks who are here as professionals today, these are the sorts of questions you can support parents in asking themselves so that they can take on that role as primary sexuality educator, and you can sit more comfortably in your role as parent educator or parent support person. All right, now, once you're familiar with your values as a parent, professional, other support person, or community member, the next step in supporting healthy children's sexuality and sexual development is getting an understanding about what typical child sexual development even is. Even though our cultures often really emphasize sexual development in the teen years or, during menopause, we really are sexual beings from birth till death. That means we go through sexual development milestones at every life stage through our whole life. When it comes to babies and young children, in the same way that children develop as far as language, motor skills, and social skills, the basic physical development, children also go through milestones related to sexual development. And in the same way as these other areas of child development, these early years set the stage for healthy development later on, and in this case, for healthy sexuality later in life. Parents, professionals are taught about what the typical ages are for talking, walking, reading, but we often don't get the chance to learn about sexual development. So here's our chance. Remember, though, that as we're going through these different stages of development, just like in all of the other areas of child development, every child is different. Different children progress through these stages at different rates, but the stages do progress in a predictable order, regardless of individual ability or differences. So let's think about the littlest ones right now. So these are the babies and toddlers, the folks who are 0 to 2 years old. And I just have to say, as you probably hear in all sorts of other places, these years before 5 are very important in all areas of human development. And when it comes to sexuality, the years before 5 are important for development too. We're born with reproductive parts, emotions, feelings. We have a need for safe attachment and nurturing safe, supportive relationships. We learn about love and trust through our attachment bonds in infancy. Those serve and return interactions result in brain development. That teaches us about communication, trust, love, how to interact with the people we love in relationships. This is the foundation for healthy sexuality. It's where we start to learn about relationships and our bodies, our emotions, our values, our communication skills. We also learn about what to expect from the people we love and depend on. 0 to 2 years is where we start to set the foundation for learning about bodies, boundaries, and roles. And at this age, we're starting to encourage gender identity in the babies and toddlers we're working with. Babies and toddlers are known to explore their own body, sometimes by accident, just moving their arms around. And babies and toddlers are aware of pleasure and body functions. But when we're talking about pleasure, when it comes to infants and toddlers, it's not a sexual pleasure that we might think of as adults that people might be able to feel once they've hit puberty and beyond. It's more of a comfortable feeling or a self-soothing feeling, especially if a baby or toddler has learned that if they touch their own genitals, it feels comforting or self-soothing for them. Now, once the kiddos get a little bit older, we're looking at preschool, we know that young children develop their gender identity. Most children have a gender identity that's the same as their assigned sex or the sex they were assigned at birth. And some children at this age might have a gender identity that's different from their assigned sex. This is often where children start to recognize that. But in the preschool years, they often don't have the language or recognize they're in a safe space to be able to even know what that means. If you have a young child in your life that consistently and persistently says they're a gender that's different from their assigned sex, it can be helpful to reach out to community respected resources such as Skipping Stone Foundation, or even talk to your healthcare provider for supports. Children at this age start to play with others. This is the foundation for all of their relationships outside of the family that happen later on. They may start to experience romantic attraction. In preschoolers, this looks like crushes that the young children sometimes get. Sometimes these crushes actually end up being the same as the sexual orientation they develop once they get a little bit older, and sometimes it's different. So the crushes a preschool child gets may or may not predict future sexual orientation. Preschoolers may, if they have the opportunity, explore the bodies with their peers. In the old days, we used to call that playing doctor or playing family. This is very typical behavior, but we can normalize the behavior even if it's unpreferred. So we can use behavior guidance comments to talk about privacy, public versus private, not touching or looking at people's privates if they happen to be doing pure exploration in a place that you know about or that you hear about. We can absolutely guide behaviors to match what's socially acceptable in our families and in our daycare settings or other community settings. Preschoolers may touch their own genitals for pleasure, but once again, this isn't the same type of pleasure we would think about as an adult. It is more about self-soothing and comforting. And this is a behavior that, although it's common and typical, if it's happening somewhere in public where other people know this is happening, it absolutely can be guided and redirected. And we're going to talk a little bit to do this. All right, so a lot of folks have asked, well, how do I know what to teach, when to teach? This is kind of why I showed up. So here we're going, is they are not too young between the ages of 0 and 6 to teach anything on the slide you're seeing. So accurate body science names for body parts. And of all the things you're learning today, this might be the one take home. Say, I learned one thing, this was it. Because when you use the accurate body science terms, it means that you can talk about this, and that they can come to you if they need to talk to you about it. If you happen to be a parent in a family or a close family member supporting a family, it means that children, as they get older and their questions about sexuality become more complex, they're still willing to come to you. They can trust you. It's easier for them to respect, protect, and take care of their body parts that have a real name, but it also builds trust in the adults around them. If you're using slang terms for reproductive body parts, it doesn't take long for kids to know that there's other words that are accurate. And it leaves them thinking one of two things. Either you didn't know the accurate name for the body part, and if you don't know that, maybe you don't know the answers to some of the other questions they're going to have, and maybe you don't know how to find those answers. Or it might teach them that you lied to them about things as simple as body parts, and then they might not trust to come to you at other times. Slang terms do tend to reinforce gender inequity and power inequity between genders as well. So when would you teach these? Well, during teachable moments. So we talk about diapering, bath time, teaching how to use a toilet. If somebody's touching something in public, you say, oh, you're touching your penis now. Penises are private, and this is public, we don't touch them in public. Private versus public places and parts is another important thing to teach. So body parts that are private are things that you would think of automatically, like genitals or bum. Breasts for everybody of every gender are private, and you know that because you don't want other people touching any child of any gender's breasts. And even the inside of somebody's mouth is considered private, again, because we don't want other people touching the inside of a young child's mouth without consent. There are some times, like in a medical situation or at a dentist, where a healthcare provider to provide care might have to touch those parts. Talk that through with those young kids. Babies and children get to learn body autonomy. Their body is theirs, and they keep their hands to themselves. This is where we can start teaching about consent. So before you touch even a baby and say, oh, I'm just going to come in and pick you up, is that okay? Now, they're 6 weeks old, they can't answer, but you've already started practicing that consent conversation. And then when they get older, those hug conversations that we were talking about. And you can also teach your young children to ask you for permission to hug you. So if a kid's coming up for us, say, oh, you want to hug me? Let's ask mom first if you want to hug, right? And so just practicing those conversations. And this becomes really important when they start playing with peers as well. You can teach the kids in your life that they can ask permission of their peers, their daycare mates, their schoolmates before touch. Where babies come from, that one's a little bit trickier. So if you're a professional working with families and kids, this would be something you would support parents to do. If you're a parent yourself, this is your opportunity to put this into context for your children according to your family values. If you need some help with that, there are those books and resources available from the Calgary Public Library. But in general, we just kind of talk about, you may or may not be ready to talk about sex yet, but by the time kids are in kindergarten and grade 1, they're likely hearing information about that from other sources. So you can put that into context with your family values, the way that I did earlier in this session. But if nothing else, this is the time to teach children that there's a difference between their digestive system and their reproductive system. Because we have a lot of backpedaling and correcting to do when we talk about babies growing in tummies and being pooped out. So here's a place where you can start to put in those bits of information in a way that's developmentally appropriate, fits with family values. And once we have these conversations and little conversations, especially in that age before 6, it makes those later conversations that we might need to and want to have a lot easier for everyone involved. If you've never talked to your children about any of this, and suddenly they're 14, 16, and they're ready to talk to you about birth control and boundaries and identity, it's hard if you haven't had that background. Please teach them that they can talk about this, and you're already doing it the moment you start talking about this, and everything you're doing to build attachment and trust. Now, there are some sexual behaviors in children that are healthy and some that are signs of a problem. And often when parents and professionals are coming to sessions like this, they're really wanting to get some information about what's typical and what are red flags I need to worry about. So the first thing I want to say right now is if you notice what is labeled here as problematic or a red flag behavior in a young child, this doesn't automatically mean they're being abused. It does mean there's something going on with this child that they likely need support to navigate. So healthy child sexual behaviors are developmentally appropriate. So they look and feel appropriate for the age. They're often questions, exploration about play, fun, discovery, curiosity. And you can see that the child is either involved in pleasure, having fun, or are curious. Use kind of those skills you have for reading your kids to see if they fit in here. Problematic behaviors would be when children are involved in some sort of sexual contact and there's more than 2 years age difference between them, and that can be chronological age or developmental age. If they're engaging in a sexual type behavior and it's continuing despite correction. Now, it can take children a long time to relearn a behavior. So for example, there are some children who have learned when they're putting themselves to sleep at home and the parents don't even know this is happening, they've learned that they go to sleep quicker if they put their hand down their diaper, and they kind of self-soothe that way. Nobody even knew what was going on until the child goes to daycare or preschool, and at nap time, that's what they're doing. Now, if they've had a year or two of practicing that way of going to sleep, it might take a little bit of correction. So, oh, you've got your hand down your diaper, touching your privates. Privates are private. You're at daycare right now. That's not private. Instead of doing that, let's hug this soft teddy bear, or I can rub your back, or teaching some of those new self-soothing strategies. That can take a little bit of time, but you'll have an idea based on your experience with that child, what a normal amount of time to relearn a behavior would be. Anytime there's a behavior where harm happens or there's a risk of harm, that's problematic, and we need to support those kiddos. If it's becoming the main activity, if that seems to be all that a child or children are doing when they get together, or anytime there's violence involved. If you happen to notice any of these red flags, please reach out. If you think that it is, if you have other signs of abuse also going on, please contact the child abuse hotline, keep those kids safe. If you're just kind of worried or not sure what's going on, reach out to your healthcare provider. You can contact 811 for additional resources. Talk to the other natural supports in your life. If you're working with social workers, other family supports, reach out to those. Now, most behaviors that are sexualized that children are engaged with are typical, and they fall into that healthy behaviors. But just because something is typical and healthy doesn't mean it's a preferred behavior in the situation that you're in. An example would be, let's imagine you've got, I don't know, a 4-year-old who at the dinner table is touching their penis at the dinner table. Very typical for a 4-year-old to be exploring their own body, probably not a preferred behavior at your dinner table. And why? Well, because the dinner table is private. So here's a strategy you can use to try and redirect some of those sexual behaviors if they're not preferred in the situation you're in. So you can say what behavior you're talking about. So be specific, like you're touching your penis at the dinner table. Because if you're not specific and you just say, don't do that, that child could be doing all sorts of other things like kicking the dog under the table, thinking a mean thought about their sister, chewing with their mouth open, using their other hand to pick their nose. And if you just say, don't do that, there's kind of setting up for a power struggle. They might just pull their finger out of their nose and look at you defiantly. But if you say, hey, you've got your hand down your pants, you're touching your penis at the dinner table, there's no question what you're talking about. Then you can normalize the behavior. So say, touching your penis can feel nice sometimes, right? Or it can feel comforting to touch your penis, right? So when we do that, we're normalizing that there's nothing wrong with this child. There's nothing even necessarily wrong with the behavior, but in this situation, it's not okay. So you can set the limits. So at the dinner table, we don't touch penises. And then once you've set the limit, give a reason or a rationale that's kind of developmentally appropriate. And in this particular example I've given, it could simply be your penis is private, the table's not private. And then say what you want them to do instead. At the dinner table, we'll use our hands for eating. And so when we kind of respond to behaviors in that way, we take away a little bit of the weirdness and the discomfort and the stigma, and that means we take away the shame and we give kids the power to be able to make healthy choices. It also teaches them one more time that we're willing and able to talk about this. Now, I do have a short video I would like to show you. So I'm going to get Laura to pull up this video. And the reason we're going to be looking at this video is as parents, professionals, and community members, it's all of our jobs to teach children about consent. And there are permission to touch, accept their answer. You can have your child ask and practice permission. Make sure you're letting other family members know that they also need to ask permission. We need consent for all sorts of things, from borrowing a pencil to patting someone on the back, giving a handshake, looking into somebody's cubby or backpack. It's just a conversation of permission, asking, giving, and receiving between people before doing something. I also want to talk just a quick moment about thinking about how do we create healthy and supportive environments in families and in the centers where our children go, and about parenting behaviors that are more rejecting. So healthy environments, there are supportive behavior, and there's avoidance of rejecting behavior. We know that when children are in environments that show supportive behaviors, the children are happier, healthier, and they actually do better in school. And when children let you, no matter who the you is, know about their identity, fears, mistakes, relationships, when you show and say affection and say thank you for telling me that, that helps create those as the supportive environments. So that was bonus content just for you. Now, here are a few different resources that you have access to. The first one is teachingsexualhealth.ca. This is a website that was initially developed for teachers that now has a parent portal. So you can go onto there in the parent section and get all sorts of additional information about tips and tricks for talking to young children about sex and sexuality, a little bit more about developmental stages, and even some videos that you might be interested in. For those of you who have a child with disability, this is a website you might be interested in as your child starts to get a little bit older. TASC.ca, talking about sexuality in Canadian communities, is another resource that you can explore. You might get some great information in there. A few more resources will be included in your handout today. And other than that, I want to one more time say thank you for coming and spending your evening with me. I know you had all sorts of things that you could have been doing with your time today, and you made the choice to come learn about talking about sexuality with children. Now, we've got about 10 or 11 minutes left, so I'm going to stop sharing this screen. I'm going to shut down